Okay, so I was raised Southern Baptist. I was raised in a great church community. My church was very nice. That there wasn't any abuse or anything like that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, raised as a kid like that. So it was almost like a second family, and they even still treat me like a family. I can bring my family to Wednesday night suppers. We live in Arizona now, but I was raised in Georgia, and if we go visit my family, visit my parents in Georgia, I can take my family to the church and have a Wednesday night supper with the same people that I grew up with, and
That's
some
wonderful.
of them, some of them have grandkids now. I only have two teenage daughters, but some of them got married quicker and have grandkids,
Uh-huh.
and we can all have Wednesday night supper in the same room.
Great.
So it's a great church. They weren't prepared for someone who kept asking questions, and
Mm.
usually my questions were, why does the Bible, especially some of the Old Testament verses, seem to be so brutal?
Mm. Mm.
And then answers like, well, sometimes God gets serious, or
Mm.
they were warned. They were warned over and over.
Yeah.
That didn't really approach the kids because I was a kid, so I'm like, and plus it doesn't really make sense to me if I'm a kid already and I'm trying to understand there's something not quite right between
Mm.
they were warned over and over, and then you're a kid. But when you're an adult, you're like, I see it now. They're talking about, let's just say that these other cultures were warned over and over, just
Mm-hmm.
decided to not pay attention. I can see that, but the kids are victims. Their children are victims. So it's a
Okay.
difference between wrongdoers. And so anyway, none of those answers made sense to me. My youth pastor gave me a book by J.P. Moreland called Scaling the Secular City. And he later wished that he hadn't done that. But he didn't really understand apologetics. He was raised under the framework of, don't ask questions, or if you could ask a question, then you got the answer and you were done. There was no
Mm.
follow up.
Mm.
And it wasn't brutal. It was just how they were raised. It was, this
Mm.
is the truth. And, what part of God says so, don't you understand? And
Mm.
I
Mm.
understand apologists now cringe at that. And I'm sure there have been Christian scholars, across history that cringe at that. But
Mm.
it was a popular mindset. And,
Mm.
sometimes it still is. And it happens everywhere. It happens,
Yeah.
even outside of religion. But anyway, so when I read Scaling the Secular City, I liked that, but my youth pastor didn't like it because it did encourage asking
Mm.
questions and researching, and his view was that you could talk yourself out of it. And to
So,
this day, he'll say, "Look what happened. He talked himself out of it. He questioned and he talked himself out of it." So he still kind of holds to the fact that researching can lead to some problems. So that's another one of those things that Christians sometimes disagree on.
mm.
Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I started to walk away. One of the biggest things that I noticed was that the answers that different adults gave me didn't match to each other,
Mm.
and the fact that they didn't match didn't bother them. They still had this sense of, leave me alone, but not saying that because, of course, no adult was ever rash with me like that. But
Sure.
I could just get the sense of, okay, this isn't welcome anymore. So I just stopped asking questions because,
Mm.
at some point, it's not comfortable for them. So I started to think, what if this is something that people just do to themselves, where they think that, this has to be the answer, I'm going to go with it,
Mm.
rather than something that's true. And that was kind of the seeds that planted my doubt. And so from my late teens to my early 20s, I started walking away. So that probably by the time I was in my mid 20s, I was full on, it's all made up. I still had some more growth to go. I realize there's atheists who say it's all made up and people need to stop thinking so foolishly. I
Yeah.
don't think like that anymore. That's not my mindset anymore. But there was a time when I went through that phase where I thought like that.
Sure.
But yeah, that
Sure.
took about 6 or 7 years for me to get to that point.
Right. And the argument goes both ways, Richard, that
Right.
I've been accused of. People that don't know me will say, well, you were raised in it. I said, no, I wasn't. I
Right.
actually became a Christian when I was 25.
Right.
So we can say, on the other side, we can say, well, you were raised in it. Maybe you should change the beliefs that you accepted when you were a child. And, so the same thing goes. It's like, I became an atheist when I was a teenager. Well, maybe you should change your beliefs that you encountered when you were a teenager. So that
Right.
doesn't
Yeah,
really
exactly.
work as a reason for why your worldview isn't right. I mean, just
Exactly.
because I came to believe in gravity when I was in third grade, does
Right.
that mean that gravity isn't real? Right? Just because I
Right.
learned
Exactly.
it when I was a child. So I think we can throw that out as an argument for whether or not Christianity or atheism or religion or non-religion is true. Just because you learn something in childhood doesn't mean it's right or it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just when you learned it. You learned a lot of things in childhood that are still true, right?
Right.
So that can't possibly. That's just an argument from chronology. Well, or like the fallacy of your religion must not be true because if you grew up in India, you'd be a Hindu. Well, maybe I would be, but that doesn't disprove or prove Hinduism is true or Christianity is false. It's just
Right.
a kind of a fallacy. I think from what I understand with you and what I've learned about you so far is that would you agree with those as being fallacious arguments for or against Christianity?
Well, this is the interesting thing because on one level, philosophically, you're absolutely right. How you were raised does not change the objective truth. It'll
Okay.
be whatever it was.
Okay,
Like
yeah.
Dr. Sygart. I don't know if you guys have had
Sygart,
Dr.
yeah.
Sygart. Yeah. I don't know if you've had him on your show,
I
but he
have.
was raised.
We
Okay.
have, yeah.
Okay, great. But yeah, he was just the opposite. He was
Yeah.
raised, do not believe this.
Right.
Nabil Qureshi was raised, do not believe this. As a Muslim, he was raised, do not believe Christianity, and they did. They changed anyway. So yeah, you're right that how you were raised doesn't change the objective truth. But part of my argument is going to be your surrounding circumstances has a whole lot to do with what you believe.
Yes, I
And it
would. I
doesn't-
would agree. I would agree.
yeah,
Sure.
it doesn't doom you. You're not doomed because people change. Atheists become Christians,
Yeah.
Hindus become Mormons,
Right.
Shinto become pagans.
Right.
It happens. So people change, but your surrounding conditions play a huge role. And I'm even going to use a metaphor at some point when I give my presentation on what I think. I'm going to use the metaphor of how songbirds are to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. It plays a huge role in what you believe, but I don't think it dooms you. It doesn't philosophically disprove or prove the objective truth.
Yeah.
But all we have to go on are our experiences. So
Sure.
that's why I kind of have the large answer to that.
Gotcha. I think, and I would totally agree with everything you said there. I was not discounting the influence of where we grow up, just
Right.
going after the idea that you hear in social media. Well, if you
Yeah.
grew up in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. Well, true, maybe so. 90% chance that might be happening, but that doesn't legitimize, objectively legitimize whether or not my faith in Christ is false or not. So.
Right. The objective true religion will be true no matter what. We could all not believe it. We
Right.
could all not fathom it. We could all, let's say that whatever the objective true religion is something that none of us could even grasp.
Sure.
The deity in charge of that would say, that's not my problem. It's, that's your epistemology.
That's your human
You're not
epistemology.
affecting, right. It's not affecting the truth that I've bestowed
Right.
upon you.
Right.
And that's absolutely true.
Right. Well, the question that we're discussing for our book club, we were talking yesterday, just sort of pre-interview stuff, and funny story that I said, I had asked you if you were writing a book, and you had said you had been thinking about it. We weren't in the process at present, but you're like not opposed to the idea. And then I just offhandedly said, I was in a little book. I didn't even say the title, and I just said I'm in a book of other different authors about the cosmos or something. I didn't even say the title. And you're like, wait a minute, do you know Alan Hainline? And I was like, how does he know Alan Hainline? And I said, he's in our book. And you turn around to your shelf and you pull up a story of the cosmos, and there I am. I was like, that's me. That was a small world. But
Yes.
the question that we're talking about, since you don't have a book, but that's fine. We've done this a few times in the club's history. The question that James wanted to talk about is something like, does Christianity lead to cultic mind control? Now, some of our listeners may be going, well, who's Richard to be talking about cultic mind control? But Richard, it seems like your military occupational skill when you were in the Marines and what you currently do now as a government employee, as a civilian, is related to this very topic. So as much as you can, why don't you give us some background in your military and currently professional career field and how this is informing our discussion today?
Sure. For almost 30 years now, I've worked in the counterterrorism industry, and I focus on radicalization. And when I say the word radicalization or radical, that's not necessarily a bad word, because you can be a radical for good things. But I focus on the radicalization that leads towards dehumanization. And dehumanization just means this other culture over here, they're not really people. So whenever people talk about killing like entire cultures or wiping out entire lineages, at that point in their mind, they're not thinking of them as humans. They're thinking of them as like viruses or some sort of a sickness or some sort of disease that needs to be cleaned. So in their minds, they're thinking, I'm cleaning. I'm not hurting people. I'm actually making the world better, because wouldn't the world be better without, disease? So that's how people see it. And so I've really spent maybe, so 30 years in counterterrorism, 10 of that was in the Marines. But I would say the last 15 or so have really been studying the academics. So like my post-grad degrees all came after the Marines, focusing specifically on the neurology and the sociology and of this radicalization towards dehumanization. So most of the books you see behind me are either about how that happened. Again, a lot of these are secular books. And I do have on the shelf below this that you can't see in here, I do have another bookshelf of apologetics books. So I'm not immune to, So I've even visited conferences and I probably have about 30 books that are signed by apologists. So I have a collection of that as well. But yeah, my main trade is why does this happen? And my big take is that I do think chaos, and I realize this is going a little bit further beyond the question, but it's important to my ministry. I say ministry as the Faithiest Atheist. I talk like a preacher, even though I'm no longer a Southern Baptist. I still feel and act,
still in your blood.
Yeah. So
a Baptist atheist.
Right. So I say, I think it's all chaos. I don't think anybody's paying attention, and so I try to see, how did it get to be like this? How did things get to be where A, all these wonderful things happen, but then B, all these devastating things happen? Why is it that there's a mix of both? And I would agree with anyone who says, well, the fact that there's anything is still amazing. And so I don't argue, too much. I don't argue too strenuously against people who say it's too awe-inspiring to not think that there's something out there. I completely get that, because man, there's times in my life where I'll still be like, are you kidding me? How can it be like this? And so I don't fight too hard against that view. I just come down on the view that there might not be something that's paying attention. For the cults who say we've got to wipe people out and we need to clean up in order to be in good standing with this higher power, I study how that happens. And by the way, that's not just religious. There's non-religious, and believe me, I know we've listened and heard the guys make their pitch. And sometimes the pitch is we need to get rid of religion, however that happens. And so it's not about religion; it's about humanity that would make people think like that.
So presently, with as much as you can share, are you presently involved in not just military interests but domestic ideologies as well?
So I have to be somewhat careful here, because I don't want to say which agency I work with. But the reason why I don't want to say that is not because it's so super secret that nobody could know. Because there are people, like if you ever saw that show 24 with Jack Bauer,
yeah,
there are people like that who are just going around kicking down doors, and you would never know that's what they really do. They have some other story they'll tell you, so that you would never have the slightest idea that they were that deeply into it. There are people like that, and they can't even talk about anything like this. I'm just an analyst. My days of kicking indoors were long over. I got out of the Marines almost 20 years ago. So as for domestic, this is very interesting, because I worked for a place that would not normally, in fact, when I began working for them, we could not study domestically, because there's rules about that. If there's going to be something where bad guys are doing something domestically and they're American citizens, then there's very, very strict regulations on who you can watch for things like that. However, with the invention of social media, and again, I've been in this for 30 years, so social media is relatively a new thing for us. Things changed, because now people are on Instagram saying, "Hi, I'm Bob. I'm a terrorist. We're going to kill people, and here's why." That changed things. So now we have open access. Fox News and CNN can go to Bob's page and listen to Bob. So if both of those guys can pick the Bobs that they like, we can listen to all of them, and we can hear what they have to say. So our study of domestic language is only for open source. Now, so here's an important thing for the audience to know. If it does turn into an investigation, if it looks like, okay, we're not just going to watch their social media, we're going to really follow them and make sure there's not a threat. And the FBI has disrupted several threats where people were serious about conducting terrorist attacks, and they were stopped. At that point, I'm out of it. So when I'm studying domestic terrorism, It's open source. It's stuff that's available to anybody. And usually the people who say that want to be heard. They want people to hear them saying that, because for them it gives them a sense of meaning. So yes to domestic, but at the same time, if it becomes an actual investigation, we are cut out of it. And other people who carry weapons, we call them trigger pullers. In this world, there's trigger pullers and non-trigger pullers, and I don't carry a weapon on duty, so other people deal with that. So that's kind of a long answer to the domestic. So I'm aware of domestic unrest, but I'm not somebody who can follow. If I meet a terrorist, I can't investigate. I would have to turn him in. I have to call the police just like anybody else, and they'll take it from there.
Sure. We talked yesterday, and we're going to get into how we're defining. I mean, the terms are loaded, right? Cult mentality. Does
Right.
Christianity lead to a cult mentality? What's a cult? So we're going to get into definitions here in a bit. But as we talked yesterday in our preliminary chat, I had mentioned that I had just learned about the Parthian Empire a couple of weeks ago in a preparation
Yes.
for an interview. And I asked you, in the context of that social media meme from last fall, how often do you think of the Roman Empire? I asked you, how often do you think of the Parthian Empire? And what was your response, Richard? What did you say?
It's funny because I tried to get out of it at first. I was like, very rarely, but it was zero. The answer was zero.
It was zero for me too. Right. It was zero for me too. And as I was looking into it when I discovered it, discovered it. Let me see if I can do this. I can do this without looking. Look at me do that. Wow. And I'm looking at her. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. So I found out about the Parthian Empire in this book. I was reading this, interviewed Craig Keener about this book. And I was like, the Parthians? He was talking about it in Revelation 19. And John's imagery of Jesus on a white horse as King of Kings. Craig believes that came from the language of the Parthians of that time. And then I put up this handsome fellow with a coin. That's an artist renditioning of a coin of Artabanus II. And Artabanus and all the Parthian kings used this title of King of Kings as they were ruling the Parthians. And so this particular king, Artabanus, was king of the Parthians while Jesus was involved in his primary ministry. He came to power when Jesus was preaching in the temple. I think if we want to date it around 12 AD or something like that. So he's comes to power when Jesus is a youth, and then his reign ends in 40 AD. But I'd never heard of him. There's Parthian coins, and a lot of people, when I was looking into this, a lot of people don't know much about the Parthians. And so I thought it was just fascinating that here is this huge empire that was actually a threat and actually defeated the Roman Empire in 53 BC, where in the Battle of Carrhae, which I'd never heard of, 10,000 soldiers, Roman soldiers, had died in the battle, and Rome, during its entire existence and coexistence with the Parthian Empire, could never defeat the Parthians. And I just thought that was a fantastic... I'm like, why didn't I never hear about this? How did I not know about this? And then we got into the discussion. About who decides what we should know about the past. Should we know something about the Parthians? If so, why? If not, why not? And that I used that as an analogy, Richard, to launch into the idea of how, in the context of what we're discussing, the question of cultic mindsets, it's obvious that cults use and manipulate, twist, and distort history. And then I offered you to your insight on that. What do you think about the historical, how cults and a cultic mindset looks at history, and then we'll talk about how you view what a cultic mindset is.
I like to use the metaphor of songbirds, because when a songbird is born, he's going to grow up and he's going to sing the song that the other adults in the community teach him. And I know some of you are like, oh, you're saying religion dooms you, but I'm not saying that. But that songbird is going to sing that song, and he's biologically programmed to grow up to sing that song. As a baby, he has no idea what you're talking about. If you could somehow talk to him, he'd say, what song are you talking about? Where's my mom? Why is it cold? But at some point, he is going to sing that song. He's going to hear it from the other adults. They're going to teach him, and he's going to sing it. So what happens is that song, which is immaterial but does exist, is out there kind of waiting on that bird to grow up. And the bird grows up and sings it, teaches it to the other birds. And so that song keeps going generation across generation. And of course, changes, and some bird communities are wiped away. But if you just look at it in terms of the songs, some songs survive and some songs die out. And it's just like for me, of course, I'm an atheist, so I'll say evolution, you know how we are.
Sure.
But and I understand plenty of theists accept evolution too. They say it was part of the design, but or at least it's part of the grand plan. But that's a whole other thing. But of course, as an atheist, I'm saying things just survive or they don't. I think the same thing for information. Information either survives or it doesn't, and then it gets passed on across generations. And of course, we're aware of that, and so we try to be in charge of what information survives into the future. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And probably sometimes the information that no one really thought about might make it through. So I'm not one of those who says that to the victor go the spoils and might makes right and the winners write the history. I'll just say that whatever survives is what survives. And sometimes it's part of an intent. You know, I'm sure if the Nazis had won, they would have made very sure that all the schools, if the Nazis just took over the whole world, all communities across the whole world were completely loyal to one Nazi HQ, they would make sure that all the schools taught the same thing. And they would, make sure that information alone is what passed forward, and they would criminalize any other information that they didn't authorize. So that's something that humans probably wouldn't mind having the power to do. I'm just saying that sometimes information that wasn't anticipated, sometimes it's not the winning history. You know, like for instance, Christians were outnumbered for a long time. You know, Christians were the criminalized. The cultures criminalized the Christians, but somehow that emerged anyway.
Right.
So it's not always about the winners. It's just about, for whatever reason, the information that survives is what survives. So when you ask me who decides, a lot of people are trying to be that decision maker and they're trying to enforce it, but it doesn't always work. It's not always the winner. It's not always the strongest. It's not always according to plan. So with those caveats, that's my answer.
That's great. And I think you bring up some really crucial points that I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion about in our book club. You talked about the Nazis really briefly there, and I know that there was Hitler had huge plans for his Reich, and one of them being the acquisition of all the artwork in the Western civilization all throughout Europe. The Nazis ransacked art and many valuable things from churches, art museums, and they were going to build a kind of a history museum of the Aryan race, and try to write history in light of this is the culminating race of history, using art in every aspect of our culture. Of course, that the monumental attempt failed, thankfully. But you're right. I mean, there was an individual trying to control the flow and the direction, both the future and the past, through his narrative. So that was a good point.
And I want to throw this out here too, because I can already foresee this question coming when people say, "Oh, so you think it's all subjective or morals, naturalism?" And they say, "Oh, so the Nazis would have been right." Well, that implies that, and I know no one's asked me this yet, but I've had it so much, I want to go ahead and say that implies that it matters what I think. And so my take is that if there's nobody watching, and if morality and our decisions come down to just us and nobody's keeping score, for me, that gives us all the more reason to try and stop Nazis. And I realize that some people will say, well, who cares if we all die? You know, if we're all going to die, then just forget about it. But not everybody thinks that way. So, while we have the Nazis on the table, I want to say, I agree that we should, stop things like the Nazis, even though I don't think there's an official scorekeeper or a grand set of rules that applies to everybody. I just agree that we should stop anyway, even if it's just my view against his. I still think the limitedness of our existence and the strict parameters of morality being just human gives us even more reason to stop the Nazis. So I want to throw that out there in advance in case anyone's preparing to say, well, if it's all subjective, then
Your example there brings up Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Do you know who he was?
He was that in the slides?
No. This is just off the top of my head as you were speaking. Bonhoeffer was a Christian in Nazi Germany and contemplated killing Hitler, and went through with it. Of course, he wasn't successful. He planted a bomb in one of Hitler's offices or something like that. And
that
then
was from the movie. Okay, it sucks that I'm familiar with Tom Cruise's version of that and not the historical version, but okay, yes.
Of course, his assassination attempt was not successful, and he was jailed and later executed for his attempt to take Hitler's life. But therein brings up another issue of how far do we go as human beings in stopping somebody like Hitler, as you say, if there's no scorekeeper. Do any ends justify the means of stopping somebody like Hitler? Should we do anything that we can, even if it's maybe against our own internal principles about what we think of the world, that this is sort of an any cost kind of thing in order to get rid of somebody like Hitler?
Right. This is one of the things that I agonize over because, I was in the Marines and while I was never ordered to do something, like kill a kid or something, I understand that there's times in history where, like, say a family's trying to hide and the baby's crying, does the mother stop the baby crying by suffocating it and protect the whole family? Or does she save the baby's life and then everybody gets killed? Those are real life decisions. In my mind, that sort of makes the case for what I believe, which is that chaos is in charge and what you do matters. And then you say, well, which one is objectively the right answer? I would say that the mothers who did suffocate the babies were part of families that kept going, and the mothers that didn't were not part of families that kept going. That doesn't make it right. I'm just saying that if chaos doesn't care, and if natural selection is just a matter of just, who's here and who's not, then that's just the way it is. And it sounds like I'm supporting that or that I'm endorsing that as if it's a good thing. I'm as horrified by it as anybody else, but I just think that's the way it is. I think that's just the cold, hard reality that we live in.
So at times you're saying that it would be necessary to suffocate the child?
Or you either will or you won't, because I could tell you, like, I couldn't kill a baby that was crying. If somebody was outside, I guess I would hand the baby to my wife and just charge the door and do my best, because I couldn't do it. So, but maybe that just means that I'm genetically not qualified to carry on the human race. Maybe some other warrior would gladly do it, or somebody would agonize to do it anyway. It's not, usually people who think that there is an absolute right or wrong will keep pressing me because they're like, yeah, but what's the right answer? And I'm saying you're either going to do it or you don't, which makes it sound like I'm apathetic or that I don't care. But I do care. I deeply care. I'm just saying that I don't think there's anyone else who cares. It's really going to come down to whether you do it or not. And then, I think we should all think about what you would do. And in my case, I just don't think I could do it. But that's not to say I'm judging somebody who does, because maybe I'm here. I might exist because somebody in my past did it.
I was going to ask that question. You're not opposed to people that are suffocating the baby.
You're not... I am, but I can also be empathetic to why they did it. And,
okay.
Yeah, I can hold that tension in my mind. I can't even if I found out that, like I have two teenage daughters, if somebody killed a kid to save my two teenage daughters, I could be grateful to have my two kids and not be applauding that they killed a kid, not be like, "Ooh, thank you for doing that." I can hold to that tension and just say, what a horrible thing, and then how lucky I am to still have my kids.
Sure. So what I hear you saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that there may be reasons why somebody would take the life of a child that would be unknown to you, and so you may be horrified by it, but you just you don't make a judgment.
Yeah, or I can make a judgment and realize that my judgment doesn't stop what happened or stop what, how events are going to unfold. I don't see my judgment as like a final say. I can be against what's happening and realize that it's still happening.
Okay. All right. I just had these bullet points. I know you read them yesterday about, I work for Watchman Fellowship. The Atheist Christian Book Club is an offshoot of what we do at Watchman, engaging with our fellow skeptics and unbelievers in civil conversation. But I thought I'd give you the brief overview of how Watchman defines a cult, and then I would be interested to hear from your perspective how you, Richard, see cult or cultic mentality. We have a couple of articles, and we have presentations on this, and our ministry is dedicated to helping Christians understand a cult. So you would come to us, and if you want a definition of a cult, here's a resource that would probably be one of the better ones to give you a definition. But All that being said is there's sociological definitions, there's psychological definitions, there's dictionary-based definitions, and then there's the popular level mindset of a definition. And so all of these things are taken into consideration. On the popular level, cults are considered sensationalist, weird, bizarre, and criminal. Dictionaries usually say it's some form of worship or liturgy. Sociologists say it's a religion. Psychology says it's a destructive methodology. So there's all these different kinds of factor, as you know from reading the literature on cult mentality and extremism. We also say that from a Christian perspective, and this is where it's distinctively Christian, that cults are pseudo-Christian religions. From a doctrinal perspective, we begin with the idea of what the Bible says about Jesus, and then we look at the cults from that perspective. So that would be, Scripture would be our authoritative anchor in how we at Watchmen are defining cults. And so we take the New Testament and the Old Testament, except for Philemon, all have something to say about false teachers, false prophets, false gospels, and heresies. So that is at Watchmen, that is our foundation. We have scripture from the New Testament, and so our idea of a cult is that group is a heresy presenting another Jesus, another portrait of Jesus. And what's interesting in the cults that we survey and engage with and talk about and have researched, most of them, Richard, have something to say about Jesus, which I didn't. That's what I learned coming to Watchmen several years ago. Was this is fascinating that most all these cults and things have something to say about Jesus and the Bible.
Yes.
This is James's book, Today's Religions and Spirituality: The Concise Guide. Christians defining a cult as a group who represents or presents an inauthentic form of Christianity, which seriously deviates from the essential doctrines of classic Christianity. And again, this is a general overview. There's so much more detail and conversation that we can have about these things. This is just a general overview here. The group claims to be a Christian or compatible with Christianity, but the organization's aberrant beliefs concerning general doctrines of the faith result in the group being classified as unorthodox or cultic. And then I would add that the distinction, I think, between, say, a religion and a cult would be the secretive, as you say, and I like it, the idea that it's secretive, it's kind of Gnostic in a sense that the inner members, the inner ring, and it's usually controlled by one person whose charisma and whose teachings are authoritative, and if that guy would die, the whole movement would fall apart. David Koresh, Jim Jones, etc. But that's extreme in terms of wiping out people that are not like them. And I think you find that ideology in a lot of cult mentalities. And then lastly, this is our simple version of how we define cults. This is a presentation we give called Marks of a Cult. Cults tend to add to Scripture. Like, this is a new revelation from Jim Jones. This is a new revelation from David Koresh. They tend to subtract from Jesus' divinity in order to say that maybe they're divine. They multiply requirements for acceptance or salvation in that sense, and then they divide the loyalty of their followers by saying, follow me or nothing else. It's all or nothing with that. So that is our brief overview at Watchmen of our definition of a cult. So I thought, please feel free to fill in the gaps or summarize or however you want to explain how you see cults and cultic mindsets, how you define it.
Okay. Two things that come to mind from what you just said. First of all, what were the four things that you said at the very beginning that people think of cults as: sensational, criminal, weird?
So the popular mindset, and this is an article about how we define a cult. The popular definition of cults usually reflect what the media portrays. So it's a media portrait of cults: sensationalist, weird, bizarre, and criminal.
That's the first thing: sensational, weird, bizarre, and criminal. I would say that there was a time when that was what Christianity was, and everybody else around society was like, "Oh my gosh, those guys are sensational, weird, bizarre, and criminal." Now I know they were focused on taking care of each other, and they weren't like, "Hey, let's go rob people." I get that, but that was the perception. So sometimes I would argue that a cult can take over. A cult could be sensational, weird, bizarre, and criminal, but then they just keep getting followers, and then pretty soon they're dominating, a large part of the planet.
With the Christians, I'm sorry to interrupt, but with the Christians, what standard was being used against them as they're being judged by weird, bizarre, and criminal? Like, what was that final, as you understand it historically? What was the benchmark that defined Christians as sensational, weird, bizarre, and criminal? What was the judgment line? How are people doing that?
and a lot of it comes from me, from reading from Christians talking about, what they found when they were discovering, their ancestors, what they were going through. But they were breaking the societal norms. There were societal norms that you were supposed to do, and the Christians weren't doing that. And ultimately, the way this group survived, the smaller group was survived, was that they were hyper focused on taking care of each other as they were being oppressed. So that in itself isn't criminal. But what made the other populations mad was that the Christians weren't repeating the social norms, and they weren't running around and enforcing the social norms, which, if you don't have to be in a cult, you can just be a part of a dominant group and think that you're violating the sacred standards by not repeating what I feel are the sacred standards. So in these positions, and I even want to say that even reminds me now that, like, in territories that were owned by ISIS, 10 years ago, there were just a few Christians surrounded by either Muslims or secular or other ISIS people, and they were considered criminal. ISIS would put little labels on their houses and say, this is where criminals live, but they were just Christians. So to use those standards, I don't necessarily mean that they are, but that the surrounding culture saw it that way, or at least the people who were enforcing it saw it that way, which of course put them in a bad situation. But I just want to point out that something that's really unpopular and not being taken seriously or being considered a threat can sometimes just take over. And it's a strange thing about human history that can happen. But then again, I'm one of those guys that says in chaos, something like that can happen. Something can emerge and take hold. So I wanted to bring that up. There is a Christian movement now that's 3 words, starts with an U, and second word is apostolic. So you figure it out from there. They're doing that as we speak, as we live and breathe. They're doing those 4 things.
That's
and
right.
They're creating prophets. And right now they haven't taken hold. They've taken hold to a degree. But they, like if Fox News says, hey, let's hear from the evangelicals, chances are they're going to come to somebody like you. They're not going to go to one of those prophets that exist right now. However, what if they do just a better job? What if in 3 generations from now, Fox News is like, well, let's go to the great prophet, Rob, and so that's happening right now.
Well, they were interviewing Koresh back in the 90s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was, before people really knew what the Branch Davidians were. He was interviewed by a few media sources, that is from what I know. But one thing to your point there, Richard, that we know here at Watchmen about cults is that a lot of them, especially the ones that claim to be outwardly Christian, in their recruitments, when they're bringing in a new acolyte, they're very good at loving, or what we call love bombing people, welcoming them in, making them feel at home, making them feel like one of them. And a lot of people that do sort of join this is a new thing, because for a lot of people that are involved with the cults, they've had a terrible history socially of fitting in. And now here finally is a group that accepts me.
Yep.
You can understand why these people grow.
Yep. To go from 0 to 100 like that, it's got to be. It's
amazing. Absolutely. So that's one absolute draw that a lot of these movements, especially the ones that claim to be new Christian revelations, can love bomb their new members to such an extent that you never want to leave these people. That's so wonderful. But the longer you're in, the more you see the multiplicity of requirements, and the more your loyalty is divided from your family and your friends, and you become isolated. And so one aspect of the cults are, isolating its members from the rest of the world.
And it's really important that those last 2, multiplying requirements and dividing loyalties, that is a key ingredient for the kind of stuff that we follow. For when a group gets to the point where they want to harm other cultures and they no longer see them as real people, two of the things that happens is that they have to keep giving up of themselves something for the good. It could be in support of a person or an icon. It could just be in support of the cause. And then not only do they have to keep doing that, they have to find people among their own peers who aren't doing it enough and say, hey, hold on, why aren't you doing this as much? I'm doing it 5 times a day. You're doing it twice a day. So what's going on here? It's only convenient for you. And then the other people hound that guy until he starts doing 5 times. And then lo and behold, somebody's like, "Hey, I'm doing it 7 times. Well, what are you
Yeah,
fivers doing?" So that kind of competitiveness is a natural thing that happens. That I think in evolution, just among some groups as they get radicalized towards dehumanizing,
sure.
um, with the caveat that it doesn't have to go that way. You can get radicalized towards taking people, assuming that humans have intrinsic value. You
Mm-hmm.
can say we have to live in a respectful, pluralistic
Mm-hmm.
society. You
Mm-hmm.
can be radicalized towards that, and I'm radicalized towards it as a non-believer. I'm zealous about this utopia that I'm imagining. This my sky daddy is this utopia where we have different views and we respect each other, and
Mm-hmm.
there's standards that you can't break, and if you break, then we have a social obligation to put you in jail.
Yeah.
That's my again that's an ideology. So we all have that. So I'm not speaking against that. I'm just saying it's when you do that to the point where you start to hate other people. That's when people
Okay.
like that get on our radar.
Yeah. Not to say that the late Dr. Carl Sagan was a cult leader. I'm not saying that at all,
Right?
by any stretch of the means. But he has some ideas here, and this is that picture on the screen. There is Earth.
The pale blue dot.
The pale blue dot, you know it well,
Yes.
taken on Valentine's Day in 1990. From, I don't know the distance, several million, tens of millions of miles away.
From Saturn. That's
from-
from Saturn.
Yeah, the Carl Sagan was instrumental in having the Voyager satellite actually turned around. This was not a planned photograph, but Carl pleaded for the folks at Voyager to turn it around, and there you have the picture. But I wanted to post what Dr. Sagan said about this. I mean, his words are, for a lot of non-believers, his words are as close to Scripture as one can get. This is probably his most famous quote, and I want to point out a couple of things about this, and then have you comment. Again, not to say that Carl Sagan he was absolutely not a cult leader in the sense, but his ideas are interesting. He says our posturings, when you look at this dot, our posturings are imagined self-important. The delusion, strong language, that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this pale point of light. And then he defines what the planet is. It's a little speck in the great cosmic dark, our obscurity. In our obscurity, he says, there's no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. And I don't know if Dr. Sagan, and I've read a lot about him, and I know that he was concerned about the proliferation of nuclear arms in the 80s when Cosmos was popular. And so, in context, I think the salvation of which he speaks was something like the total destruction of the planet through nuclear arms. And so I think that's the context of what he means, but I think he's onto something that I think is, in general, not just cultic mindset, but in general, two things that are systemic of human beings, is to say that, to say something about ourselves, that Sagan believed we were delusional to think that we have a privileged place in the universe. And then to say that there's this need of salvation. So you state a condition about the human condition, you state something about it, and then you have a solution. And I know that Carl Sagan advocated for science. He has a book called Science as a Candle in the Dark. And to be charitable to Carl, I think he advocated that he thought science would save us from the maladies that he thought were enveloping us. But I think this is a mentality that is prevalent, whether it's a cult or Christianity or whatever. That do you think, Richard, that there's a systemic human conviction that something is wrong with all of us?
Yes. Yeah. Now we're really getting into it because again, with our main question of does Christianity lead to the cultic mindset, my main answer is going to be that humanity leads towards this cultic mindset. And this is the same thing that commercials do. Every commercial that comes on is that there's a problem. Relax, don't worry, we got it. And here's a solution. And this is the solution. Please don't be fooled by the fools that say they have the solution. This is a solution. This is a problem. You can't get away from it. But don't worry, we got you. That is a human. The reason why commercials work like that is because that's a human condition. And as much as sometimes theists will say that atheists just don't care, we're nihilists because we think nothing matters. All of that stems from this idea that meaning has to come from something else out there that's kind of imposed on us, and then we discover that meaning. And so they're like, if you don't believe in that, then you're just here for a brief bit. Might as well go rob a bank because you're just going to die anyway. But there are a lot of people who see things like Carl Sagan that say, okay, the fact that we're so limited, and the fact that meaning comes from only from with us is all the more reason, which is what he says here towards the end. It's all the more reason that if we're going to stop this, we are the ones that are going to have to stop this. It's not going to come from someone else. So in that case, I kind of agree with his last sentence. But we all have this. We all have this, like, something's going to have to change to fix these problems about ourselves. And a religious person might say, well, God's going to come make it right, or some other deity is going to come make it right. And an atheist might say, well, you're not helping. But, I can't say that they're not helping, because a lot of the people who are taking part in solutions today are still religious. So I don't say that religious people are just, waiting with their eyes towards the sky saying, please come help us. They're taking action too. So there's times where atheists misrepresent religious people to say you're only thinking about help from God, and you're not taking action. But most people are Christian. Most people are religious, and then here in the West, most people are Christian. So it's not true that they're not taking action, because everybody's taking some sort of action. So I'm not saying that atheists are right either. But this concept of something's wrong, we've got to fix it, and religious people will say it comes from above, and atheists will say it can just come from us. We should probably try to agree that we're all trying to help, and then we just have different reasons. Atheists will say it's because we're limited, and Christians will say we're doing this because God mandates it. But if we have the same goals, and in some cases we do, at least on that respect, we can work together.
Okay. I know we've talked a little bit professionally about your background and what you do and how it's related to the topic. In a general sense, and I know you don't speak for all atheists or agnostics, and I think you've touched on this question already a little bit. We've given you our Christian Watchman definition of what we think a cult is. How do you think, constructively speaking, an atheist or a non-religious, it doesn't have to be an atheist, just somebody might be spiritual, just non-religious, or whatever the case may be, from a non-Christian atheistic skeptic perspective, and I'm not using those terms in any way to sort of pigeonhole anybody, but just from a non-Christian perspective, let's just say that. How would you judge what a cult is? And from what I've heard, if I can steel man your position, it seems like you think that the line in the sand, if you had to draw one, would be it becomes a cult when you're willing to harm other people.
Not necessarily, but when we at my work, and again, I want to point out one of the reasons why I'm not saying which place is because when I talk about cults and when I talk about radicalization, I'm not giving the company line. So I don't want to go against the company line. Sure. So, but it's really important for this discussion and for these kind of discussions. For me, the key is radicalizing towards dehumanizing.
Okay.
So in that respect, if you're going to be on our radar at work, you have to be dehumanizing other people. However, if there was a cult that started today that said, we're going to have a pluralistic society where we respect each other's values and then we have standards that you can't break, I would be part of that cult. But does it, if part of it was, well, you have to give us $500 a month and you have to, pray to our leader.
Pray to Bob.
Then I would be like, okay, now I'm not going to be part of that cult. But and I know some of these slides have mentioned John Haidt. In John Haidt's study on cults, it was the giving up of yourself towards something that intuitively seems like that would harm the cult's existence, actually led to the cult lasting longer. So the more you gave of yourself, even though it didn't make sense, the cult actually lasted longer because the collective effort of that individual zeal, when added up, actually led to the cult lasting longer, even though when you looked at what the cult was doing, it didn't seem rational.
Sure.
Individually it was irrational, but for the endurance of the cult, the idea, like I was saying with the songbirds, the ideas lasted longer, probably because they were willing to give up of themselves. Very similar to ants, just like if you attack an ant bed, all the ants stop what they're doing and come to defend the ant, even though you're bigger than them and you're probably going to kill them. That reaction is probably why ants have lasted for hundreds of millions of years and probably dominate the earth. Even though it doesn't make much sense as an individual to stop what you're doing and run towards the threat, they do it.
Right. So I want to get your thoughts. I'm sorry.
That too. I was just going to say that was an essential part of what I mean.
2018, Stephen Hassan came out with a book called Combating Cult Mind Control. And from this came the bite model of cult mentality. I don't know if you were familiar with that, but he defines
Not until I saw this.
He defines something, what is healthy versus what is unhealthy and destructive. And I think the column on the right side, it sounds like if we had more time to get into the details of how you consider cult mentality and the dehumanization of things, of people,
Right.
That you would find a lot of these characteristics on the unhealthy side of the bite model. Now, the bite means behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. And I know you had only a brief chance to glance at this yesterday, but overall, in a quick bite here, what do you think? A quick bite, no pun intended. What do you think of the model here? How accurate do you think it is?
I think it's helpful if you're looking at it from the perspective of how he's approaching it, because these activities over on here on the right can be very unhealthy and can be very destructive. The reason why I don't think they're universal is that, like what I was just talking about with the ant colony, some of those ants are, just like zealots that, and maybe what they do would be unhealthy for them, but it's healthy for the colony. Not that I'm defending the colony, but if I'm imagining a reality where there's nobody in charge and it is chaos and whoever's here is still here, some of those stuff on the right are sometimes evolutionary advantageous, however those adverbs work.
Okay.
That doesn't make it, this is where atheists and Christians get into fights sometimes, because some atheists say, oh, evolution, well, that means it's sacred and wonderful. A lot of atheists will be like, well, no, this is awful, but we think this is how it is. And then Christians are like, well, how dare you, support these qualities? But from some of us, we're like, it's not that I'm supporting them. It's just that there probably were times in our history where human tribes who were our ancestors were awful. There was no human rights. They were very suspicious of outsiders. They were just fierce warriors, and they probably did things that would just freak us out, but they're related to us, and we inherited some of their views.
Okay. So two follow-ups with this, because I know on the right side, you see in the middle of the column, the right side is claims to absolute authority. Yes. And I think we would both agree, tell me if you don't, that authority isn't bad by itself. It seems to be systemically necessary for our existence. We have to concede authority to governments and police and experts in their field, scientists and whatever. So it's not like we're disparaging the idea that someone claims authority in a subject, because authority, briefly, you would think that there's good authority, right? Does that exist in your point of view?
Well, yeah, and that goes back to Carl Sagan's quote. He's still appealing to an authority too. He's just saying the well-being of our planet. So everybody believes in authority. One thing I say about objective morality, everybody believes in objective morality. Now, it might not be a thing, and I suspect it's not really a thing, but I think a key ingredient to our success is to believe that there is. And so that, the Christians will say, well, absolutely there is, but ISIS will say, well, absolutely there is. And then there's even some atheists, and I understand there's moral anti-realists and things like that. But almost anybody that I talk to about morality, at some point, even if they say there is no objective morality, at some point I'll say, how important is it to you that I believe what you're telling me right now? And usually they'll say it's everything. You've got to believe me. And I'm like, it sounds like there's something going on there. And their pushback is that, well, it's epistemology, it's not morality. But one thing that I want to push in my presentation is that when you go far enough down your worldview, you could be atheist or Christian or some other religion, at some point epistemology and morality come together and they become like a valuing framework. So
yeah, I agree.
There's no real distinction between epistemology. I understand that it's separate definitions because one is correct information and one is right or wrong information, but at some point they become a valuing network, so that an atheist gets just as riled up and ready to fight as any religious.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to make, Richard, that epistemology isn't value-free. We hinge on it because we think it is good, right? There's a qualitative aspect to our knowing. And
Yes.
so I would agree with you there. I want to move on a little bit because this is something
Okay.
more systemic to us. We've sort of been talking about cults, and many of our audience members go, well, I'm not in a cult. I would never join a cult. I know what a
Right.
cult is. And by this point in our conversation, basically, well, that doesn't pertain to me. But we are talking about mind control. And I love this book. I read this in the 90s when I was a new Christian, Neil Postman's Technopoly. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this because here we are on a Zoom call using the latest technology to communicate.
Yes.
Neil Postman had this term called technopoly. His future utopic. Well, he wasn't actually advocating for a technological utopia. He's saying that the milieu of technology and technique that we have is a kind of technopoly. He says it's a state of culture, and it's also a state of mind. It consists in the deification, his words, of technology, which means that the culture seeks its authorization in technology, finds its satisfaction in technology, and takes its orders from technology. And getting back to the question of authority and epistemology, it seems like really what's silently or tacitly, or maybe not so tacitly, governing our thinking, telling us how to think, when to think, where to think, valuing this particular way of thinking is the technology that we accept.
Yes.
How much of off the religious topic here for just a second, how much do you think technology is deliberately or maybe indirectly causing us all to sort of have a cultic mentality? I think that what happens to atheists and Christians and just anybody, any tribe that gets on social media and has a tribe versus tribe, it tends to, in what we've been talking about, it tends to dehumanize ourselves. We get snarky, sarcastic, rude, and mocking. Christians do it. Atheists do it. Anybody, whatever your political side does it. This is, I think we would agree, a human problem. How do you see? Yeah, how do you see the technology maybe amplifying this problem of being jerks to one another?
Real quick, I want to say that social media is radicalizing us towards dehumanizing, but nobody programmed technology to do that. What they programmed technology to do was to keep us at the keyboard. So like Facebook, Google was like YouTube, were like, introduce them to things that keep them at the keyboard. And so technology was like, okay, I'll try pretty people. Here's some dancing pretty people. And here's some kittens, here's some jokes. But what they found really keeps us at the keyboard is controversy. So they're like, find something that he thinks is important. Okay, we got that. Now, why don't other people think this is important? And it could be environment, it could be religion, it could be nationalism, it could be sports, it could be politics, any topic, whatever you think is really important. And you think, I'm going to give up of myself to uphold this idea. Technology figures that out. And then they say, okay, what's wrong with these other people? How come they don't do it? And the technology is not trying to make you mean. It's trying to keep you at the keyboard. And it works. People start researching and they start to think lesser of them. And then there's podcasts that say, okay, well, there's a hunger for this kind of information, so I'm going to make a podcast. And if I'm listening, let's say I'm a Christian. If I go to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, but I listen to my favorite podcast twice a day for 7 days a week, I'm eventually going to be an actual podcast religion. Even though I'll say Christianity and Bible, chances are I'm actually going to be aligned with my podcast guy who's echoing my research habits because they see that there's an appetite for that. And so I think that's what technology is doing. So the reason why I don't even think in terms of Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian anymore, that's not even really what I see anymore. Now it's, the Ben Shapiro Christian, even though Ben Shapiro's Jewish, or the Jordan Peterson Christian, or the Kenneth Copeland Christian. It's not becoming denominations anymore. It's becoming icon based. And that's because of technology.
Well, Jaron Lanier, who's a Silicon Valley, people have called him the consciousness of Silicon Valley, wrote a book in 2018 called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. And he has this quote, it's a little saucy, but it's just to the point of what you said. With nothing else to seek but attention, ordinary people, you and I, tend to become because the biggest ones get the most attention. This nastiness is also turned out to be like crude oil for the social media companies and other behavior manipulation empires that quickly come to dominate the internet because it fueled negative behavioral feedback. And I think being on social media for a while, and I know you have too, we have probably been one of these eggs who have just delighted in the demise of people that disagree with us. And that is one reason, as a Christian, I do our YouTube channel for our ministry. But for the most part, besides the podcast, I don't do Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, simply because I was becoming one of those bad eggs. I was starting to see that in myself. And every time I get a nasty comment under one of my old YouTube videos, the old self just comes up, and I just want to be an instant jerk to the person who was an instant jerk to me.
And it's very intuitive to go that way, to be one of the expressions of these eggs. It feels very intuitive, and it feels righteous. And righteousness can be addictive. And I'm not saying righteousness is a bad word. It's just that self-righteousness is addictive, and it feels like you're on the right path, even if you're being destructive.
Right. This is just a study that came out in 2021, summer of 2021. Moral outrage shaping the fundamental aspects of our social life is widespread online in social networks. This research looked at over 7,000 Twitter users and 12.7 million tweets. And basically, Richard, they've affirmed what you've been saying, that they get positive social feedback for outrage expressions. So the only way you're going to get views or followers or likes, it's a reinforcement. It's like B.F. Skinner with the bell and the salivating dog. You get a like for being outraged. You just keep posting outrage posts. And it just spirals. It's an uncontrollable spiral of negativity.
Yes. And I would say my hope, and of course I'm an optimist here, my hope is that because I think so much of existence is hit or miss, I think what might happen is we might get so sick of this that people are going to say, okay, I'm just not going to be taking a part of this, which I think might lead to good behavior. Like the reason why I am like I am now, and I try not to be like what you just described, is because I tried it and I realized how addictive it was for a time, but how it wasn't helpful. So now I just fight that impulse. So I feel the impulse. And I'm like, okay, I recognize that impulse. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go the other way. And I think that's just, learning lessons through the environment. And I think this might actually lead to us going the other way. It might take 2 or 3 generations, but it might lead to us taking it in the other direction. Yeah,
you mentioned Jonathan Haidt, and I wanted to have a quip from his book. I have read some of it, but not all of it. And Haidt says on, I think it's in the introduction, page 23 of the introduction. He says, the message of this book, and I'm talking about the righteous mind, why good people are divided by politics and religion. He quotes from Matthew 7. He quotes Jesus' words. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take out the log of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And so a little personal aside here. I've been in the Atheist Christian Dialogue since the early 2000s. I was on the Richard Dawkins website when I was a new Christian, a relatively new Christian, learning apologetics and polishing my arguments in forums and atheist forums and talking to atheists. But I was so concerned about me winning arguments and me finding fault with atheist arguments. And, it's fun. You tear down people. You play gotcha. It's terribly addicting. But this verse, brings me back to my own sanity. I have a log in my eye, and the reason that Jesus says, here's how you can tell it's a log in your eye, when you're more concerned about other people's behavior than you are your own. And Jonathan Haidt had said this. He uses an example in the book of when he's at the computer and his wife gets onto him about leaving dirty dishes where she makes baby formula. And she says, you can't do that, honey. Don't leave your dirty dishes. And he starts making an excuse. As he's working on the chapter about being a hypocrite, he's like, I'm a hypocrite. I'm making excuses for something that upset my wife. Instead of just saying, I'm sorry, honey, I'll fix it. He's like, well, I did this and I didn't have time. And blah, blah, blah.
Hold on. I wanted to throw something in. In 2018, I went to watch him speak at ASU, and he was talking about how you have a tendency to misrepresent people and dehumanize them. And then he was talking about how 2 critics kept pushing him. And he was like, and then these morons, they kept doing it. And he was like, hold on, I'm doing this in front of a live audience. And it's on YouTube now. He's like, and he's like, keep it in. Here I am doing the thing that as I'm preaching not to do it, I caught myself doing it. So it's funny how that is.
And we were all doing this, and we've all done it. And if you've been on social media, you've probably done it at least once or twice.
Yes.
But he brings up, his book was published in 2012. That's the year Rodney King died, in 2012, sadly. But May of 1992, He was involved, of course, the LA riots. I actually lived through that. I was not a Christian, and I was living in Los Angeles at the time, right in the middle of all that civil chaos and unrest. And that is really how God started to get my attention. I didn't immediately become a Christian at then, but I said, I have to get out of LA, something else, something greater. My first encounter with something greater than myself was the demise of the city in which I lived. Very sad situation when you think about it. And so it made me, we were talking about media, and I had this question as we were thinking about this. KTLA is a TV station in Los Angeles. They were the ones, they were the ones that aired the Rodney King tape. And a question came to mind: why would a station want to do that? I'm not here making a judgment and asking that question, but simply looking at the deeper question of, they knew that this would be sensational, but at what cost? What personal cost beyond Mr. King's unfortunate situation? What personal cost to him? I wonder what kind of burden that became for him by being a kind of a celebrity from one of the lowest points in his life. That here the media, I don't want to say exploited, but my gosh, the influence of media projecting contempt and hatred. Well, here you go. The first kind of viral video, I would say, but this seems to appeal to the baseness of our nature, doesn't it, Richard?
It does, and I have no doubt that when they decided to play it, they were thinking, look, this is a crime that people can't really visualize until we show it, and we have to expose it.
True.
So I don't think they were like, haha, let's see how much money we make. However, once this happened, because I'm like you, I remember when this happened. I'm 53, and I was in Washington, D.C. When this happened, and I still remember it, just like the Challenger exploding and 9/11. I remember this. So this, I think you're right. This was when advertisers and news companies says, this is the thing. Look how we've got their attention now. So I think people exploited that. I don't think that KTLA was trying to exploit.
No, I'm not accusing them of that. Yeah, no.
Right. I know. I'm just saying that because that happened, I think advertisers and a lot of people were like, I know what to do now. I know how to go forward from here. And we did go forward from there.
A year later, David Koresh and Waco make the headlines. April 19th, 1993, the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, just south of me here by a couple of hours, burned to the ground. Several people died, including Koresh and children. The world hadn't heard about Koresh, but this was on CNN. This was on every news agency. Our boss, James Walker, was at the ABC affiliate in Dallas talking about the Branch Davidians when this fire erupted live, and James was there in the newsroom. We have a whole podcast about James's experience with that. But again, here we have sensationalism. You think about, in the day and age where there wasn't cameras, how long would it have taken us to learn about a fire in Waco, Texas, in the age where there is no rapid instant communication? It's amazing in our day and age of media how much this got circulation, and you wonder what kind of impact this kind of story has when it goes around the globe. You start to think, well, the world is coming undone because this little cult in Waco, Texas burned themselves to the ground, and now the whole world seems to be coming apart simply because CNN was paying attention to it.
Right.
But that's I'm not saying the media is a cult, but I am saying, and I think it sounds like we agree, that we have to be aware, and this is what Neil Postman would want us to think about, we have to be aware of the kind of information that we're ingesting and the way it's making us think. I think we can agree that we should all stop and pause and think about what we're taking in and how we're giving it back out. Would you agree?
And I preach this all the time. I say there's so many examples of people not doing this every day throughout the world, and yet we're called to focus on the times where it's not happening. And that's not to say we should ignore the times where it's not happening. We should think of those as things that should be mitigated or corrected. But we shouldn't think this is everywhere just because it's all that we see. And that's very counterintuitive. It's not easy to do that.
Right. And this was a quote I found doing the research for our talk. Václav Havel, before the U.S. Congress in 1989, shortly after he was elected president of the then Czechoslovakia, he says, "We still don't know how to put morality before politics, science, and economics. We are still incapable of understanding that the only genuine backbone of our actions, if they are to be moral, is responsibility. Responsibility," and I like what he says here, responsibility is to something higher than my family, my country, my firm, and my success.
I
So
agree with that.
I don't know what Havel's religious affiliation was, if he had any, but I do seem to think that in order for us to get out of the mire of self and hatred and dehumanization, that we have to look to something beyond ourselves. Would you say that,
Yes,
Richard? I know that you
absolutely.
know where I'm going with this in terms from a
Yeah.
Christian perspective, but
Yes.
what's the higher realm for you as a non-believer?
Yeah. In fact, I wanted to bring this up. Depending on whether we talk about it now or later at the next
Sure, we can talk
event.
about it.
But yeah, my biggest thing is that um, there's times in history where cultures learn to work together just because they had limited resources. And so it's like the tragedy of the commons, which I know all the scholars in your group, and I guess everybody is a scholar in your group. But yeah, the tragedy of the commons is that, the cultures can ruin themselves and their resources if they don't figure it out. And there's a scientist who's passed away now named Eleanor Ostrom,
Mm-hmm.
who studied the different cultures throughout history and around the world, who figured out how to share resources and still not destroy each other and destroy the resources. And what she noticed was that they all came up with common principles, and I think she called them common core principles. And there's like 8 of them. And so these developed through trial and error. They developed because they were like, hey, we got to stop killing each other. And so they became rules that they just got together and said, okay, even though this is going to be bad for my culture, I've agreed to this rule. I'm going to submit to this authority based on my agreement. And then I'm going to go back to my people and say, look, I'm going to be unpopular with you, but this is something we have to do because we agreed to this. And this is,
Yeah.
I'm going to sell this. That happened naturally. So she was like, this happened at different points in history among different cultures in different languages. And she said, now they might have said later, well, this was revealed to us from the mountains, or this was revealed to us from the great whatever. But it's a lot of the same core principles happen, and it was just they were kind of cornered into it. They were
Yeah.
kind of forced into doing it. So I do think that there's a biological answer for why we experience this transcendent feeling of connected to other people.
Yeah. We're going to wrap up here. I know I'm kind of 10 over time, but let's take a few minutes to talk about this. Maybe you noticed in the slides, I started with the king of the Parthians, then I talked about Rodney King, and then I just talked about the former Czechoslovakian president.
Right.
In terms of answering the question, getting back to the question, does Christianity lead to a kind of cultic mindset or mind control? And so in the book club, we generally tend to ask our skeptic atheist guests what they think about Jesus. And this is not for you and I to sort of argue about it, but just to lay out your case for who you think Jesus of Nazareth is. And so we know, from being a Baptist, the account of Jesus being brutally mistreated by the civic authorities.
Yep.
And so, and I'm not putting these terms in here to put words in your mouth, but I was wondering what you think of the accounts. So it's kind of a double question. So we have Jesus in the accounts, but what do you think the accounts are? I'm assuming you don't believe in the resurrection.
Right.
So from your perspective, Richard, what is the best historical explanation for what these accounts of Jesus are? Are they cultic mind control? Are they propaganda? Are they entertainment? Are they eyewitness history? What do you think?
Okay. I always like to think in this, when I have these conversations, I always like to introduce like an imaginary alien who was here. So like aliens who recorded everything around the earth from every angle so that we have video recording of what actually happened. And so the aliens come and say, we actually know exactly what happened during this time. But before we show you, we want you to tell us what you think happened. If those aliens came to me and said, what do you think happened? I would say, okay, there was an intense hunger. There was an intense appetite for a Yeshua to come and make things right. And from their mind, it wasn't like a resurrection. It was like, no, these guys were right. You guys were awful. Whoosh, all of you are gone. Now you are all repentant and you're all going to be upset now. And these guys were right. And I told you, and you should have known. That was an appetite. And it was fierce among this population. And then fast forward years later, there was a narrative that actually is what happened. And that narrative dominated against other narratives. Now, what happened in between that? I do think there were historic Yeshuas who were there and were really upset with the Roman authorities. They were even upset with the Jewish authorities who were kind of placating Roman authorities. They were upset with the population. So they were really beset on all sides. I think there really was one Yeshua that, even Bart Ehrman or Brian Keaton, I think is like a secular Jewish guy who says no, there really was a historical Yeshua. I think that existed too. That he because this for me this aligns with reality. I can see a leader who's like the Romans are wrong, the Jewish people are wrong. My own population, the way they're trying to navigate this is wrong. And I'm going to get in everybody's face and I'm going to be unpopular, but I'm going to hold to my guns. I'm going to stick to it. Because in his mind, and I realize I'm, creating this imaginary figure, but I think this is what happened. He was zealous to this idea, to this concept, and it was driving everybody else crazy. And so that made him unpopular, but it also made him popular within his group. And he was also feeding into this appetite. And there was, again, other people feeding into the appetite. And not only that, there were people around all of that telling stories to say, here's how this all makes sense. So a combination of all that led to this narrative that he was resurrected. I do think he was killed. I think, obviously, if you're just going to stick to your guns and not back down and be popular enough where you're challenged, then you're going to be executed in that time. So I do think he was killed, and I think there was times when he could have backed out. I think there was times when he could have said, "Man, okay, never mind, I'm out," and he didn't do it. So in that respect, it's inspiring. But yeah, I don't think he was resurrected.
What do you think? And I know you saw these last night when I sent them to you.
Yeah.
And your version may not be here, and these are just some that I've heard as a Christian. Historically speaking, what do you think accounts for the best evidence of what the disciples were writing about, or these accounts were writing about? Because from Matthew to Revelation, we have the idea that Jesus did resurrect, and some of the accounts are saying that people did see them. People did see the risen Jesus. How would you best account for what you think the disciples saw, or do you think that the stories are just made up of the disciples seeing something? What do you think is the best explanation? Thank you for the resurrection in this regard. And these are just some options I've heard. I'm not saying that you have any one of these positions or you have to take any one of these positions. Just food for thought.
Right. Yeah. None of these answers match what I think. Because for me, it's not just Jesus and the disciples, it's the people around Jesus and the disciples who are all trying to come up with explanations. And so for me, it's like I said before with the songbirds, there's information that's competing with each other for resonance. So I think that it's possible that despite what Jesus went through and despite what the disciples went through, and they could have gone through anything, there were narratives about what happened. And the narrative that he had the right answer, that he had a plan all along, and that he rose again, and that he did it for all of humanity, that narrative won out. And I don't think it took centuries. I don't think it took centuries at all. It could have taken a few years for that to, there's the idea about centuries later doesn't work, because I think Paul was just 20 years later. So I don't think centuries, but I do think that narratives can form and grow so much that even the historical figures involved can't stop it, and that's happening now. I mean, there's like the Sandy Hook thing. At this point we can see tens of thousands of people who think that was never a historical event. There were no children. Those families who are grieving were hired to pretend to grieve. That's a narrative that still takes hold today. They could go to the town and meet the families. They could, if they wanted to, exhume the corpses if you want to get as dark as you possibly could.
Sure.
But they're not going to. The narrative has won. In their minds, the narrative has won. So narratives form and grow sometimes despite what historically happened, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's not what happened here. Okay. It didn't have to take centuries. Within weeks of Sandy Hook, there was already people saying, wow, man, I heard there was something else going on. And, this was really just about deep state and paid actors. It doesn't have to take centuries. It doesn't have to be, legends don't have to start as a legend. They could just start as a narrative that resonates. And then over the centuries, they become legends. So I do think out of C.S. Lewis's Liar, Legend,
Lunatic and Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think legend. I think the fourth L is right, but it wasn't a legend at first. It was just a narrative that was more popular. All right.
And I'm going to push back on that. We'll just throw that out there for the discussion of our club.
I'll get that at the book club. I know.
Yeah, that'll be on the table for the book club. This is just something for our audience to think about.
Yeah, so this is the heart of my ministry because I was in the Marines, and there were times when we were ordered to, go take care of bad guys, and especially in Iraq, there were times when bad guys would go into people's houses, and specifically because they had families there, and they knew that we wouldn't just blow up the house, that we'd had to go in. So even as Marines, which a lot of people think of Marines as just heartless and we'll do what we got to do, even as Marines, we agonized over this. How do we get rid of the bad guys and not deal with the good guys? Now, in this particular case, it's specifically targeting an infant, and that the free world comes into, is down to the free world, and not whether or not we do this. In 1889, I don't know how I would have seen that. Right now I think of it as like somebody having a time machine or something to give that
I know,
order.
yeah, it's a time machine experiment, right?
Right. So yeah, and especially if I'm in charge. And so yeah, I was a staff sergeant in the Marines in Iraq. So there were times when my decision would make or break what we did. So if somebody had told me, it's hard for me to put myself in 1889, and especially in 2004 and 5 when I was in Iraq. If anybody told me to kill an infant, then I would have been required to raise the alarm. But I understand what you're trying to say here. 1889, you don't have that requirement. You just follow orders, and if you don't, you're executed.
Right.
Me personally, I wouldn't do it. I probably, knowing the Marines, and although I wasn't alive in 1889, just knowing the Marine mindset, I probably would have been promptly dispatched and dealt with, and somebody else would have done it. I just probably couldn't have done it. But
Okay.
I understand that in the Marine mindset, you're supposed to take orders, and if not, there's consequences. For me, I couldn't fathom how poisoning an infant would lead to the free world. And if there was like an all-knowing deity who's like, I know this is confusing to you, but this is important that you do it, it wouldn't make sense to me that he would put me in that position. So if I was religious, it wouldn't change my thought. I would just say, okay, I believe in you, but this doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to do it.
Okay. So to be fair, I'll answer it myself. I was in the Army.
Okay. Okay.
I'm with you. And I think even still today, there's a level of which if you're disobedient to a command in wartime, I think it's different for peacetime. But the consequences of disobeying a direct order are severe.
Right.
I set this up a little bit with the background that we both know what chain of command is, and we both know that our chain knows more than we do about what's going on, right?
I would just
sometimes maybe
right. Okay.
But
we could talk about a whole show about that.
We could do a whole show about what the chain of command knows and doesn't know. But suffice it to say, whether or not we agree with it, that they're in possession of a kind of knowledge that has led to this. This isn't a random situation, right?
Right.
There's boots on the ground here for a reason. We might not agree with it, but they have a reason for doing this. And you're thinking in your brain, why an infant?
Right.
Okay. Now you mentioned time machine. And we would have to introduce an element here that it would not be introduced in the natural world to sort of spoil the analogy here. But for me personally, I would say I couldn't do it, Richard.
Yeah,
I couldn't do it either. I don't know. I was never in a situation in combat, or I was never in combat, but we're trained to kill.
Yes.
And I know that it weighs heavy on a lot of Marines and Army soldiers and people who have been in the Army, that the PTSD is a very real thing, and it's a very serious thing. And I don't mean to make light of that by doing this. A lot of guys are in situations like this all the time. Maybe not quite this extreme or whatever, but the taking of a life is a serious thing, no matter what we're doing. I would be scared. I probably wouldn't do it, and I would probably risk death because I wasn't doing it. So we would both fail in our mission, Richard.
Yes, I would.
We would fail in our mission. Okay, you guys, you failed your mission. Come back home, and we face the consequences, whatever that might be. Now, I'll pull back the veil and say why. You were probably wondering why April 1889.
I can guess.
What do you think?
Hitler.
Yeah. If you knew that child was Adolf Hitler. Now, this introduces an unnatural aspect to this. Now that you know who this child is, would you do it?
I still couldn't do it for two reasons. One, it's still a baby at the time. And two, the dangers of Nazism had a lot more to do than just one guy. There was an appetite there first, and this one guy stumbled into it and then had the capabilities to make it work for a while. We have that now. We have situations where there's a hunger and there's an icon, fortunately, who doesn't have the capabilities. He doesn't know how to run with that. But so Nazism had two factors. One guy who just wanted to be the guy and had a vision, and two, the audience that was excited about it. And then he had the capabilities and the power and the structure. A lot of that structure pre-existed him, but they suddenly were loyal to him. So killing one guy wouldn't make a difference. I think another type of Hitler would jump in and take advantage of that. So,
let's say
for those two reasons, I couldn't do it.
Sure. Well, let's just say, analogy's sake, for the sake of that I guess maybe the fundamental question is, if you knew that your actions would prevent Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, would you do it? If you knew not assuming that somebody else would come along and do the same thing, but that you would actually by doing this, there wouldn't be a Hitler at all, and there wouldn't be a Holocaust. You're saving 6 million lives.
Right. For me, it's like the trolley thing, the philosophical thing.
1 or 6 million. Right.
Right. I get that, and I would just say I'm just still too weak to take the life of a baby. And also, I would say I understand how philosophers would put me in that position, but I couldn't understand how reality would put me in that position. So if I'm hearing you right, and I want to be fair, is that the objection? To some degree, is that the objection that you have with God's existence? Is that God wouldn't put you in that situation? Right, or at least the way I understand God, or at least the kind of God that makes sense to me, is the creator of all things, who had 14 billion years of exact fine tuning, all these cosmic things that had to happen just so we could be here, and even then, once we're here, a bunch of stuff that had to happen just so. That creator wouldn't even occur to him to put an adult in the position of whether or not to kill a baby to save other things. That whole trolley thing is a 100%. I once had Eric Hernandez say, "What's one thing that you're 100% sure of?" I'm 100% sure that this kind of thinking is human thinking, and it has nothing to do with what the kind of cosmic 14 billion year creator outside of space and time who loves us would ever do. I'm 100% sure of that.
Because I think in the analogy for me as a Christian, I look at I know you know the gospel, but I look at God giving his only son for the sake of, as John 3:16 says, the sake of the world, the cosmos, which is what the Greek is in that famous verse that you see, John 3:16. So God so loved the world, and that's the Greek for cosmos, which is the arrangement and the order of people within the world, that he gave his only son. And so in some sense you have in the Christian story Jesus taking the wrath of the Father upon himself. All the Old Testament wrath was poured out on Christ. You know that. I know that you know that.
I'm familiar with that, yes.
Yeah. And so I would say one of the things that I became a Christian was because of one verse in particular that started me on the road to faith in Christ was Proverbs. It's trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. And it's not just sort of a blind obeisance to, okay, God, whatever, I'm not going to think about this, I'll just trust you without thinking. It was more of like, God is God and I am not. And so in the sense of, I know, people, I don't know where you are on this, but I know that people have objected to God's existence based on I think you did say it earlier about the judgment on other people with children involved.
Right. Yeah. And I just had a debate at ASU on that.
Yeah, I saw part of that a little bit, and I thought, so is that would you say that would be the primary reason that if God was going to judge a people, that he should spare the children in a sense?
Right. Well, I've said that the kind of God that I think would go through all that cosmic 14 billion year fine tuning to get to us now would have better ways to deal with it, so that. In fact, I imagine that God, and again, I'm projecting myself onto God, but man, aren't we all? Isn't all 8 billion people on this projecting ourselves? For all the people who say, hey, you can't, it's not you, it's God, they're doing the same thing. So like when they're like, hey, well, God's will was shown to us in this passage, they're doing the same thing. So I'm not too worried that I'm doing it. I really think I'm fairly analyzing what a 14 billion year deity, creator, fine-tuning, loving, knowing all of us would do. he wouldn't put us in that situation. He would say something like, "Hey, this village has to go, and I need to teach you guys how to take care of wrongdoers, especially wrongdoers who aren't listening and they're just rebelling and doing whatever. I'll take care of the kids. But by the way, this is an important point. There's a human value moral mandate that I've imposed upon all of you, all of my creations, that you are to treat each other as if the human life has value on its own." Mm-hmm. And, write this down. This is important for divine inspiration. Put this in Deuteronomy 12. And then now you're going to go into the village. You're going to fight the adults. Don't worry about the kids and the moms. What's going to happen is I'm going to take them into another room, into another dimension. They're going to peacefully fall asleep. They're going to be in heaven. You'll never have to deal with that. But the wrongdoers have to be dealt with. And they need to know that humans are the kind of people who will right the wrongs, because I can't just be intervening all the time. You guys have to self-govern until you come up here. I'll take care of the babies, so that for two reasons. One, the babies are victims. The babies are victims. They're not part of this wrongdoing. They're victims. And then two, it's psychologically traumatic to impose that kind of mandate onto an adult to slaughter an infant. It's psychologically traumatic. And I wouldn't do that, because I've spent 14 billion years preparing for you guys. So for those two reasons, don't you dare harm the babies. I'll take care of them. Just deal with the wrongdoers. That's how I see that.
Okay, that's a good overview of your position. Do you think
that's my 100%? That's your
100%. Okay.
Yeah, he's like, you're so wishy-washy. Maybe there's a God. Maybe there's tell me something. That's my thing.
Give me a solidity. Okay, so yeah,
that's my.
Could God have? Is it possible in your view, your 100% view, that God, in taking the lives of the children of these cultures, brought them to Himself in eternity?
Right, and that's covered in my perfect where Richard is guide. He brings them into another dimension. The night before the battle, the moms and the babies go into another dimension. They peacefully go to sleep. They're in heaven, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, our husbands were wrong to do this, and we took part in it too. Oh my gosh,
Yeah, so God could save them. Awful. God could save them.
Right. Well, God could save them, or He could just take them to heaven directly in another dimension outside of the combat, because the combat is ugly, as you know, and it's traumatic on the adults doing it, especially if it's just a little newborn.
Sure.
So, but however, as I study radicalized people who hate entire cultures, and they're like, cut them down to the and their lineage and their children's children and their children's children. That's a very human thing. So any kind of language where people are like, kill the babies too, that's 100% human thought. And by the way, there's Christian scholars who go along with that. There's people like Greg Boyd who say, okay, when you see that, that's their tribal instincts kicking in. The Bible was divinely inspired, but they brought this into it, and they shouldn't have. So it's not just an atheist saying this. I mean, there's Christians who are like, yeah, that's not something that God would command.
We'll stir a lot of spirited conversation at the club with your thoughts, and wrap up with this question, and we'll leave it with this. And we've been going a lot longer than I thought we would, but
we're passionate. We're both passionate.
Yeah, no, it's good to talk about these things and talk about them in a civil manner. Let's say God exists, and the God of the Old and New Testament exists. I mean, that Yahweh is believed to be Jesus incarnate, or Yahweh incarnate is Christ, and so the God of the New and the Old is one and the same. And I know a lot of skeptics object to the idea of the wrathful Old Testament moral monster God, kind of what we've been sort of talking about a little bit. If this God was real and was in Richard's universe and Richard's court of law, you investigated this individual. And the FBI, he was in human form. Yeah. What in Richard's court? What would you do to him?
So this is a person who's here on earth, sort of like Jesus, but he's also a representative of God, but he's in human form.
Yeah, I mean, he is, for example's sake, he is the God of the Old Testament who's come down and made himself available to your court of law. And this guy is allegedly guilty of, let's call them war crimes or whatever, or dehumanizing infants and women and all this stuff. What do you do in Richard's court of law?
So this is very similar to what we were just talking about. It's that perfect being putting me in this position where he's just kind of waiting to see what I would do. And it wouldn't make sense to me, but I could imagine us being under the power of a creator who's messing with us, or a series of powerful beings who are just messing with us. Like, this is sort of like the trolley problem, but we just want to see what you're going to do before we, mess with you some more. If I was in that position where I really believe this is a human who's submitting to my will, to my judgment, judicial system, but I also firmly believe that he could smite us, then I would not mess with him. I would say, okay, this is a very powerful creator, and I'm not going to establish my judicial system upon this person because I believe that he has the power to really harm us. And again, I'm not celebrating, I'm not worshiping this guy. This is more fear. I'm terrified of this person. And, so no matter what, I'm screwed. But at the same time, I'm not going to, this idea of, especially me being in the Marines, there's been times when I think the authorities maybe weren't being as wise as they could have been.
Sure.
Maybe just sort of messing with me, where I just surrender and say, okay, look, I can't do anything about this. But that's not a loving, worshiping, wonderful, inspirational situation. That's just sort of a sad situation.
Okay.
And so, and even then, that kind of speaks to itself. Like, why would something with that much power put me in that position? So, in regards to this question about whether Christianity is part of a cult or will make you be part of a cult, I actually think there's parts of Christianity, and I'm an atheist saying this, I think there's parts of Christianity, there's messages in the Bible and there's messages from Christian leaders that can help people not be part of a cult. So, if not being in a cult is your goal, I think there's messages within Christianity. The verse about, look into your own eye before you judge others. The messages about how we're all intrinsically corruptible, and no matter who you are as a person, with the best of ideals, you can still be corruptible. These are messages that you can take to heart, so that if you're following something and you're excited about it and you're feeling righteous and you're suddenly seeing yourself do things and think things that don't seem right, these messages could be like a wake-up call to say, wait a minute, hold on, what am I getting involved in? Remember that I can be corruptible even though I'm a good person. And a Christian would say, I'm trying to be a good person. However you square that. Even though it's not my intention to be this way, I am corruptible. And be able to look at myself before looking at others. Those are Christian messages that can keep you from falling into a destructive cult.